All right, hello to all of our listeners out there prepping for the UPSC.
Especially those of you tackling international relations as your optional.
You know, when you pick IR, you're not just in it for the facts and figures.
You're ready to dive into the deep end of political theory.
And that's exactly what we're doing today, folks.
We're going deep on those big, essential concepts.
The ones that'll really help you understand international relations on a whole other level.
It's almost like a cheat sheet, you know?
A fast track to getting your head around some of the densest ideas in political thought.
Yeah, the stuff that can make or break your UPSC IR prep.
Okay, so let's kick things off with a question. Do you think ideas are what shape the world?
Or is it the other way around? Does the world actually shape our ideas?
That's a classic question.
One that's been bugging thinkers for ages.
And it gets right to the heart of how we understand global politics.
You basically stumbled upon the age-old debate of idealism versus materialism.
Ooh, fancy terms. Break it down for us.
Well, on one side, you have the idealists, like Plato.
Okay, Plato. Famous guy. What did he think?
He believed in this realm of perfect, unchanging ideas.
Like ideas that exist outside of our everyday world.
Exactly. And for Plato, these ideas are the real deal.
The true reality. More real than, like, this table I'm sitting at.
That's what he thought. The world we see and touch is just a shadow of those perfect ideas.
Okay, so for an idealist, it's all about these big concepts guiding reality.
Right. But how does that play out in, say, foreign policy?
Yeah, good question. How do you have an idealist foreign policy?
Well, imagine a policy built on the idea of universal human rights.
Okay, I'm with you so far.
An idealist might say these rights exist everywhere, regardless of culture or country.
And
And they should be protected globally no matter what.
even if it's, like, really difficult in practice.
Even then. It's about holding on to those principles no matter how messy the real world gets.
But what about the other side, the materialists? They must disagree.
Totally. Materialists, like John Locke, they're all about what we can actually observe.
So tangible things, like stuff you can see and touch.
Exactly. They think knowledge comes from experiencing the world.
Makes sense.
So for a materialist, the driving forces in international relations are things like economic interests.
Or maybe power dynamics, geographical realities.
That's right. Those are the things that really matter, not some abstract ideals.
Okay, so help me out here. How would that play out in a real-world scenario?
Sure. Let's say we're talking about why countries form military alliances.
Okay, good example.
A materialist would probably say it's all about strategy.
Like protecting your borders or getting access to resources.
Bingo. They wouldn't care so much about shared values or ideology.
So the idealists are all about those big ideas, and the materialists are about the tangible stuff.
Right. It's like looking at the world through two different lenses.
And for us UPSC folks, we need to understand both, right?
Absolutely. Both ideas and material conditions shape international relations.
It's like having two different tools in our analytical toolbox.
Exactly. Now, let's move on to how we reason about the world and build theories.
Okay, so we've got these basic frameworks in mind. Where do we go from there?
Well, there are two main ways to think about this: inductive and deductive reasoning.
Ooh, more fancy terms. I'm intrigued, though.
All right, so think of inductive reasoning like starting with observations.
Specific things you notice.
Yes. And then from those observations, you build up to a general conclusion.
Okay, so if we're talking IR, it'd be like...
Noticing that economic sanctions often don't work.
And then concluding that sanctions are usually not a very effective tool.
You got it. Moving from specific cases to a broader idea.
Makes sense. Now, what about deductive reasoning? How is that different?
Deductive reasoning is kind of the opposite. You start with a general principle.
A big idea.
Exactly. And then you apply it to a specific situation.
Okay, so let's say our big idea is that democracies rarely go to war with each other.
Right. Deductive reasoning would lead you to predict that two specific democratic countries
Are unlikely to fight.
Exactly. You're taking that general rule and applying it to a specific case.
Interesting. So how do these two types of reasoning help us build theories?
Well, you have descriptive theories, which try to explain how the world works.
They use observations and evidence, right?
Yes, they're built through inductive reasoning.
Okay. And then what about the other kind?
Evaluative theories, they analyze things based on values and criteria.
So they're more about judging whether something is good or bad.
Exactly. And they often rely on deductive reasoning.
So a descriptive theory might explain why civil wars happen.
while an evaluative theory might ask if it's ethical to intervene in another country's civil war.
Wow, that's a really tough question.
It is, but both types of theories are important for understanding international relations.
This is helping me see things from a different perspective already.
That's great to hear. But here's another question. How do we avoid bias when building these theories?
Yeah, that's a good point. How do we make sure we're not just seeing things through our own limited lens?
That's where the difference between facts and values becomes crucial.
Okay, that makes sense. It's easy to mix those up, especially in international politics where things can get heated.
Absolutely. So facts, those are things you can verify. They can be tested and observed.
Like, country X increased its military spending by 15%.
Perfect example. Values, on the other hand, are judgments about what's right or wrong.
So country X's military buildup is a dangerous provocation. That's a value judgment.
Exactly. And it's super important to be able to tell those two apart.
Otherwise, our values could cloud our judgment and lead us to misinterpret the facts.
Right. You need that clarity to analyze events effectively.
All right, so we've got to be careful to separate facts from values.
Yeah.
But where does ethics fit into all of this?
Well, there are a couple of main frameworks we can use to think about ethics in IR, deontology, and teleology.
Okay, break those down for me. What's deontology all about?
Deontology focuses on moral duties and principles.
So, like, there are certain actions that are just wrong no matter what?
Right. Like torture or genocide. A deontologist would say those are always wrong regardless of the circumstances.
Okay, I could see that. And what about teleology?
Teleology, also called consequentialism, judges actions based on their outcomes.
So it's more about the results.
Yes, it's about weighing the potential benefits against the potential harms.
Interesting. So a teleologist might say that intervening in another country's affairs could be justified.
If it prevented a huge human rights disaster, for example.
Even if it means violating that country's sovereignty.
That's the kind of dilemma teleology grapples with.
Wow, these ethical frameworks can lead to some really different conclusions.
Exactly. And as future diplomats and policymakers, you need to be able to understand and wrestle with these different viewpoints.
This has been incredibly eye-opening. I feel like I'm already starting to think about international relations in a whole new way.
That's fantastic. But we've only just scratched the surface.
There's so much more to explore.
We'll be back soon to dive into even more key concepts.
Don't go anywhere, folks. We'll be right back.
Stay tuned. Okay, so we've been talking about idealism and materialism, but there's another concept that's super important, especially for aspiring diplomats and policymakers.
Okay, I'm all ears. What is it?
It's called rationalism.
Rationalism, huh? So like being rational, using logic.
Yeah, exactly. Rationalism is all about the power of reason.
Okay, so how does that play out in international relations?
Well, think about it. Diplomats are constantly dealing with complex situations.
Conflicting information, different agendas, hidden motives.
Exactly. And a rationalist approach would emphasize the need for clear thinking.
So instead of reacting emotionally or going with your gut,
You step back, analyze the evidence, weigh the consequences.
and ultimately make decisions based on reason. Sounds good in theory, but does it actually work in the real world? I mean, what if you're dealing with a leader who's totally irrational?
That's a great point, and it highlights one of the potential weaknesses of rationalism.
It kind of assumes that everyone is playing by the same rules, right?
Yeah.
That everyone is prioritizing logic and reason.
You got it. But as we know, the world of international relations can be pretty messy.
Yeah, there are all sorts of factors at play. Emotions, ideologies, cultural differences.
Exactly. So while rationalism is a useful framework, we need to be aware of its limitations.
So it's a tool, but not the only tool in the toolbox.
Precisely. And there are other schools of thought that offer alternative perspectives.
Like what?
Well, some critics of rationalism, like Michael Oakeshott,
Oakeshott, I've heard that name.
he argued that rationalism can sometimes dismiss the value of tradition and experience.
Okay, so accumulated wisdom, the things we've learned over time.
Exactly. He believed those things can be just as valuable as pure reason.
Makes sense. It's like just because we're trying to be more rational doesn't mean we should ignore the lessons of history.
Absolutely. And for you, as a UPSC aspirant, it's all about considering different viewpoints.
Right. We can't just rely on one way of thinking. We need to be flexible and open to new ideas.
Exactly. Now, let's switch gears a bit and talk about how we perceive and analyze information.
Okay, sounds good. What are we diving into now?
Subjectivity and objectivity. These concepts are super important for understanding global events.
Okay, I've heard those terms before, but remind me, what's the difference?
Subjectivity basically refers to your personal perspective. It acknowledges that everyone sees the world through their own unique lens.
So like two diplomats from different countries might view the same conflict totally differently.
Exactly. Their interpretations would be shaped by their own backgrounds, their national interests, their cultural values.
That makes sense. So what about objectivity?
Objectivity is about striving for impartiality. It's about trying to detach from your personal biases.
So like presenting the facts of a situation without letting your own opinions get in the way.
Precisely.
Hmm.
Now, true objectivity can be tricky, especially in international relations.
Yeah, there's always going to be some level of bias, right?
Absolutely. But the goal is to be as impartial as possible.
To see the bigger picture, to consider all sides of an issue.
Exactly. Now, this leads us to another interesting concept. Relativism.
Relativism. Okay, I'm intrigued. What's that all about?
Well, relativism takes the idea of subjectivity a step further.
How so?
It argues that there are no absolute truths or universal values.
So what's right or wrong depends on the context.
Precisely. And this has huge implications for international relations.
Like what might be considered a human right in one culture might not be in another?
Exactly. And this can make it really difficult to navigate global issues.
Yeah, trying to impose your values on another culture could backfire pretty badly.
It certainly could. So cultural sensitivity and understanding are super important in diplomacy.
Makes sense. You've got to be able to see things from different perspectives. Now, this is all making me think about history. How do these ideas apply to how we interpret the past?
That's a great segue. And it brings us to another important concept, historicism.
Okay, historicism. What's that all about?
Well, historicism emphasizes understanding historical events in their own context.
So no judging the past by today's standards.
Exactly. We can't assume that what we consider ethical today would have been seen the same way centuries ago.
That's true. But doesn't that make it difficult to learn from history? If everything is so context-dependent, how can we apply those lessons to the present?
That's a great question. And it highlights another aspect of historicism. Some historians believe that while each event is unique,
There are also broader patterns that we can observe throughout history.
that's the idea. And for you, as a UPSC aspirant, this means studying history not just for facts and dates.
But for understanding those bigger trends and forces that shape events.
Precisely. History can teach us a lot, even if it doesn't offer simple answers.
I love that. It's not about memorizing, it's about understanding. Now, before we move on, is there anything else you want to add about historicism?
Well, I want to leave you with a question to think about.
Okay, hit me with it.
Think about all the concepts we've covered today.
Rationalism, subjectivity, objectivity, relativism, historicism.
Got it. Now, imagine you're analyzing a current event, like an international conflict. How do these different lenses shape your understanding?
Wow, that's a great question. It's like we've been building a toolkit, and each of these concepts is a different tool for analysis.
Exactly. And the more tools you have, the better equipped you'll be to tackle those UPSC questions.
This is making me feel way more confident about the exam.
That's fantastic to hear. And remember, there's rarely one right answer in political theory.
It's more about how well you can argue your point.
Exactly. The UPSC examiners want to see critical thinking, independent analysis, and a deep understanding of the material.
This has been so helpful. Thank you.
My pleasure. Now, are you ready for the final stretch of our deep dive?
Let's do it. Okay, so we're back, ready to round out this deep dive into political theory.
Absolutely. It's been quite a journey exploring these complex ideas.
Yeah, my brain is definitely feeling full, but in a good way. Like all these pieces are starting to fit together.
Exactly. The more we connect these concepts, the more they make sense.
So what's next on our agenda? What other big ideas do we need to unpack?
Let's talk about pragmatism and utilitarianism.
Yeah.
These are two frameworks that can really help you understand how societies work and how political systems evolve.
Okay, pragmatism first. I feel like I kind of get what that means.
Yeah.
It's about being practical, right?
Yeah,
Focusing on what actually works.
you got it. Pragmatism says we should judge beliefs and actions based on their results.
So in international relations, a pragmatist would be less concerned with sticking to a rigid ideology.
Right. They'd be more interested in finding solutions that actually work on the ground.
So compromise, flexibility, adapting to changing circumstances.
Exactly. A pragmatic diplomat would be all about getting things done, even if it means bending the rules a bit.
So it's not about being right all the time, it's about being effective.
Precisely. Now, how about utilitarianism? Have you come across that concept before?
I think so. It's something about maximizing happiness for the greatest number of people, right?
That's the gist of it. Utilitarianism is an ethical framework that focuses on maximizing overall well-being.
So a utilitarian approach to, say, foreign policy.
It would prioritize actions that benefit the majority, even if it means a smaller group might be worse off.
So, like, providing foreign aid to a country where it's proven to reduce poverty, even if it's expensive or politically risky.
That's a great example. A utilitarian would weigh the costs and benefits, and if the overall impact is positive.
Then it's the right thing to do, even if some people disagree.
Exactly. It's about looking at the bigger picture, at the overall impact on human well-being.
Okay, I'm getting it. So we've talked about all these different theories and frameworks, but how do they actually help us on the UPSC exam?
That's the million-dollar question, and it's what makes this deep dive so relevant for all of you aspiring diplomats and policymakers.
So it's not enough to just know these concepts in the abstract. We need to know how to use them.
Absolutely. Remember, the UPSC is all about demonstrating critical thinking.
So if I get a question about, say, the conflict in Syria,
You shouldn't just rattle off a bunch of facts about what happened.
I need to go deeper, analyze the underlying causes.
Exactly. What role are ideology, power dynamics, or historical grievances playing?
And then I can bring in those theoretical frameworks we've been talking about.
Exactly. Can you analyze the conflict through a realist lens?
What about a constructivist perspective? Or maybe a feminist approach?
The more perspectives you can consider, the more sophisticated your analysis will be.
It's like having a whole toolbox full of different lenses to look through.
Precisely. And remember, there's no one right answer. The key is to build a convincing argument using evidence and theory.
Okay, that takes some of the pressure off. It's not about guessing the correct answer. It's about using my knowledge to make a compelling case.
You got it. That's exactly what the examiners are looking for.
Wow, this deep dive has been so eye-opening. I feel so much more prepared to tackle those UPSC questions now.
That's what we like to hear. And remember, political theory isn't just about passing an exam.
It's about understanding the world, analyzing complex issues, and maybe even shaping future policies.
So keep exploring these ideas, challenge yourself, ask questions, and don't be afraid to dive deep.
The world of international relations needs your sharp minds and your fresh perspectives. So go out there and make your mark.
Absolutely. And if you enjoyed this deep dive and want to hear more,
Don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more episodes of The Deep Dive.
we'll see you next time.